Greetings and salutations. Thank you for clicking on the video. I say that because somebody recently said they missed me saying that. I stopped saying that because people were telling me they didn't click on the video, that it showed up in autoplay or they downloaded it or whatever. But there you go. I said it. Thank you for watching nonetheless. I don't really know how to begin this video because I don't know the words to impress upon you how important what is going on right now in the Linux and free and open source software communities is to the future of Linux. October 2018 is going to be remembered as the month that Linux changed forever. We have reached a tipping point of some sort, and everything is different now. On this channel, when I do Linux-related content, it is usually aimed at casual Linux users, people who want to use Linux as their desktop because it's more secure than Apple or Microsoft, or maybe you are a computer enthusiast and you like to play around with different distributions of Linux. So we talk about Ubuntu, Linux Mint, a few other distributions, play around, that sort of thing. I do not get into things about enterprise space. I don't really care much about servers, to tell you the truth. We don't talk about things like containers or development or what it takes to build software from code, or few things every now and again. So I don't comment on all this stuff as it rolls along. But what happened was IBM just bought Red Hat for $34 billion. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. That happened on Sunday. I want to kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about Microsoft, because I have had so many people ask me what I thought or send me something that is based completely on speculation. I had one person who actually put in a comment that said that Microsoft had bought Linux Mint 17, and because of that, they changed the code or something like that. I don't know where it came from, and I posted back, that didn't happen, and they posted back, no, it really did. They did. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there, gang. So let's talk about this for a while. I have been digesting the news. First, I want to talk about Microsoft and how they're making their way into Linux. And then I will do what everybody else is doing a little bit later on, and I will speculate on what their goals are, because I think they're the ones that raise the most eyebrows. So let's go ahead and talk about MS first. What have they done? They worked with Ubuntu. It's been a while back, a couple of years ago now, or actually about 3 years almost now, that they worked with Canonical, the company that distributes Ubuntu, to make Ubuntu available in Windows 10. That was a big deal. Essentially, what you can do is you can install Windows 10, and then you can go to the store in there and you can download and install Ubuntu. By the way, it's not just Ubuntu anymore. There are other distributions available. And it will be a program that runs on Windows. It's the Linux subsystem for Windows. What you get is a terminal that runs Ubuntu with no graphics. But you can do a lot with that. And for developers, I guess that's something that people need. So that went on. Then we heard about Microsoft becoming a major contributor to the Linux kernel, and they bought themselves a place on the Linux Foundation's board of directors to the tune of about $500,000 a year. Now that's chump change for Microsoft, but that is just about the base salary for Linus Torvalds, who works for the Linux Foundation. So that's about what he makes in a year. Other companies pay that as well to be on that board of directors, including Google and many others. So it's just interesting that Microsoft would be that interested. Then Microsoft suddenly jumped up and bought GitHub. For those of you who don't know what GitHub is, it is a central repository for open source free software projects. I have stuff up on GitHub for the little programs that I've written for the terminal. Linux Mint has the entire damn code for Linux Mint up there. So does Ubuntu. So do many other Linux projects. That's where you can go to actually look at the code. You can fork the code. You can download it. You can do whatever you want with it. That's part of the open and open source. There are other places that people can put their open source code, but GitHub has been a central place. Well, Microsoft jumped up and bought it. At that time, I commented on it and I said that that's nice. I do not trust Microsoft, and we've had all this wonderful stuff come from them about how they love Linux, and all along I've just sort of said, well, if they love Linux, then why aren't they open sourcing their stuff? Because they hadn't had open source anything up to now. Well, it wasn't like a week ago, Microsoft came out and said that they were open sourcing 60,000 patents. Here you go. We're just free now. We'll just give it to you. These are patents, by the way, many of them, that they have ongoing court cases over people using them, mainly in Android phones and other places, that Microsoft has made it their mission to sue people over these things. Now all of a sudden they just go, well, never mind. They just threw billions of dollars of revenue out the window that they could have got if they would have pursued these patents and gotten the licensing fees and all that other stuff. So good for you, Microsoft. Great. Then, as I'm digesting this piece of information, and many people have asked me about it, and I just honestly couldn't answer because I was like thinking about this going, what's the deal? Then this story drops on Sunday. IBM, which is a company that we have not been talking about nor thinking about, where the hell has IBM been for all these years? I remember buying IBM computers, and they certainly made the world's best keyboard in the IBM Model M. And if you know what that is, you've been playing with computers for a long time. But lately, what has IBM been doing? Well, obviously, they've been saving up their money so they could buy Red Hat Linux. So what is Red Hat Linux? We don't talk about Red Hat Linux on this channel because Red Hat Linux is Linux that is designed for enterprise use. They do have a desktop that you can install. It is not a desktop like we think of in Ubuntu. CentOS is the open source version of Red Hat. It's like Red Hat without the licensing and all the contracting that goes into it. And if you install CentOS as a desktop, I'm sure that you'll be happy to move on to something else really quickly because it's just designed for business use. It's designed for specific business type things and servers. And the advantage to Red Hat has always been the fact that if you bought this, you got like the most intense customer service available. That, yes, you spent a lot of money to be able to have a license to run Red Hat Linux on your servers or your corporate desktops or wherever you're putting it, but they would come and fix it if it broke. The support was unbelievable. And getting Red Hat certified means that you have to go through a lot of stuff to get there. So that's the thing about Red Hat. It's not for the average consumer at home, and it's quite expensive. You wouldn't want to do it unless you really needed to. So that's what Red Hat is if you're not familiar with what it is. Red Hat has been the poster child company for a long time in the open source community that says, see, we can make money with open source software. We don't have to have proprietary licenses on our software. Remember, everything that Red Hat does, or most of it, they do have some closed source stuff that they have, but most of it is available on GitHub, or you can download CentOS. They have the Fedora project, which is sort of like a desktop that you can download, and that's always been thought of as being very cutting edge. It was like beta testing for Red Hat Linux, also known as Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Some people call it RHEL. You'll hear that all the time. So for these guys to get bought, it's like major. And of course, people are sitting back and trying to analyze this and trying to figure out what's going on. And I really don't know where the future is for Red Hat, and I really don't care, to tell you the truth, because, like I said, we don't talk about Linux for enterprise on this channel. What we talk about is Linux for the average user. I don't even talk much about Fedora because I find it to be a little bit too cutting edge. And fun to look at, fun to read about. I don't want to run it on a daily basis. If you like Fedora and you run it all the time, great, good for you. Just not my cup of tea. I would rather stick to the more newbie-friendly stuff like Ubuntu and Linux Mint and stuff like that. So what you're seeing, ladies and gentlemen, is between Microsoft and IBM, these companies have just spent billions and billions of dollars to get in on what is happening with open source and Linux, but not on your desktop. This is all because of cloud computing. You see, IBM has had no real cloud strategy. Right now, the money in computing, the money in technology is in cloud, which means that we think of a big corporation, like those old 50s movies, that up on the 20th floor, the whole floor was nothing but computers and data center space and all that stuff. No, that's not the way it works today. Data services to most companies are handled through something like Azure or Amazon's AWS, or even smaller companies like DigitalOcean and Voltaire. Like, for instance, the website that we have for this Easy Linux project, that is on a cloud I have a little cloud thing going on where it's a virtual machine. It's a server out there that I have access to. And what's going on is that, especially in the case of Microsoft, those virtual spaces that they're making available, that infrastructure is being used to run Linux. So Red Hat really has not made... I got to be real careful about saying this because it's mostly speculative. But I'll back it up here in a minute. Red Hat has kind of been declining in their deployments simply because of the fact that Ubuntu has been moving faster. Ubuntu has been a little bit easier to deal with for companies. Companies are afraid of what's known as vendor lock-in, which means that we have this system up there and then somebody turns around and socks it to you and says, oh, you have to pay us more money because you absolutely have to upgrade. And with Ubuntu, the companies feel more free because there's no licensing, there's no strings attached, there's no contracts like you have with Red Hat. So I don't know what IBM sees in them and how they're going to work, how this is going to work in the future. I just don't know. I absolutely don't know. But I do know that I've heard that Red Hat implementation has sort of stagnated. And obviously that is something that Mark Shuttleworth has heard as well. Mark Shuttleworth is, of course, the guru in charge of Canonical and Ubuntu, the founder. He is the guy who started the Ubuntu project, and he was the first, passenger in space and all that stuff. Interesting fellow. But usually when this kind of stuff happens, they don't say anything. Canonical keeps their mouth shut. However, this time around, Mark Shuttleworth jumped right up, and he talks a little bit here in these paragraphs about how Red Hat has had declining deployments and things like that. So that's where we're getting that. And also I've heard that as well. This two paragraphs here is kind of interesting, so I would like to read this. The acquisition of Red Hat by IBM is a significant moment in the progression of open source to the mainstream. We salute Red Hat for the role it played in framing open source as a familiar shrink-wrapped replacement for traditional Unix on Wintel terms. In that sense, RHEL was a crucial step in the open source movement. Nevertheless, the world has moved on. Replacing Unix is no longer sufficient. The decline in RHEL growth contrasted with the acceleration in Linux more broadly is a strong market indicator of the next wave of open source. Public cloud workloads have largely avoided RHEL, container workloads even more. Moving at the speed of developers mean embracing open source in ways that have led the world's largest companies, the world's fastest moving startups, and those who believe that security and velocity are best solved together to Ubuntu. So that's kind of what I was talking about before, and that's something I've heard in the background as well. Because while Red Hat is extraordinarily stable, for instance, I use CentOS on my web server because of the stability factor of it. We could have used Ubuntu, but we decided to do CentOS because it's familiar. It is not groundbreaking. it moves very, very slowly. Whereas Ubuntu has a much faster release cadence. And for a lot of companies who don't want to get locked in, they don't want to think in terms of a 5 or 10 year solution. They're really just worried about, let's get this up and running. We can figure that out later. We can move it to something else if we need to. Ubuntu makes more sense because they can jump right into it. You just go right for it. And that we're not talking about Ubuntu like you think of, like we talk about here a lot of times. This is the focus of Canonical. This is what they want. They want to sell that landscape service to companies who are deploying it on servers in cloud instances. So why does Microsoft care about Linux? Well, mainly they care about Linux at this point because they have this giant system called Azure, which at this point in time is more than 50% running Linux. So people get an account with Microsoft and they spin up all these little virtual servers, little virtual machines in the cloud, and they install Ubuntu or some other Linux distribution on it. And that is where they're moving. So Microsoft is not running Azure to be running Windows anywhere. It's Linux. Also, the Internet of Things. Microsoft would dearly love to be a part of the embedded technology sector. They just, at the beginning of the year, released their first ever Linux project, a little operating system called Azure Sphere that runs Internet of Things devices. They want to be a part of that because you have to understand, like somebody posted on that video I posted, 5 mistakes that new users make for Linux. Somebody posted not too long ago, they said that Linux was an experimental system that will always be a niche. Could not be, that is so untrue, it's not even funny. Linux forms the base of this entire internet structure that's all around you. It runs the servers, it runs Facebook, it runs Google, it runs YouTube, it runs your microwave, your toaster, your crock pot that has the, your whatever, your hair dryer. If it's an IoT device, if it connects to the internet, your smart TV, chances are it's running on Linux. Microsoft wants to be part of that. Linux on the desktop has been slow to be adopted because Linux on the desktop has grown in fits and starts. And my opinion is it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that it has come to a reliability state where it was truly a replacement for Microsoft, Windows, or Apple. Microsoft doesn't care diddly crap about Windows at this point. They don't make any money off of that. They do not care about the consumer space. What they care about is Azure and cloud, and that's where it's at. And if more than 50 or 60% of the customers for Azure are running Linux on it, they have a problem. Because, it's very famous about the memos about Microsoft saying that Linux was a cancer, and that's the culture of Microsoft 20 years ago. I think that Microsoft is starting to realize that if they're going to compete in the future computing world, it's going to have to be less about hanging on to every little patent and that's Bill Gates' attitude of lock everything down than kind of just playing along. You can make more money playing along, and the free and open source movement has won a major coup. Now, some people may say that, well, Microsoft getting involved with Linux is bad. IBM is going to kill the unique environment that Red Hat created for their working environment, all this other stuff. That may well be true, but the truth of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, is that open source is winning. We have won the battle. We have shown the way. I have been involved with this seriously for the last 10 years. I know that there are people out there who remember way back a long time ago. Linux had a false start in the late 90s and early 2000s. It wasn't ready yet. It wasn't ready when Ubuntu came along in 2004. We just didn't have the polish necessary. We've got it now, not only in the server space, but in the desktop space. More and more programs are coming to Linux. More and more companies are starting to say, hey, we really need to be part of this. Now, speculation time. let's talk. I don't know anything about IBM, so I really can't comment on that any further. I just put that out there with the information that I had on hand. But when it comes to Microsoft, the one thing that I know about Microsoft as a company is that it's like any other major, huge corporation. Within large corporations, there is not one person or even a group of people who are really in control of this organization. There is always factions within such a large organization. That was very true when they introduced Vista, Windows Vista, years ago. There was a younger faction of developers within Microsoft that wanted to basically take everything they had, put it in the trash, and start over. There was some older engineers and developers that had been in the company for quite some time that knew this was going to be a major problem. You can't break people's computers, and there was a bit of a problem between these people getting along and getting things together. It's just factions within the company. So Vista was released, it broke a bunch of people's computers, and then when Windows 7 came along, the older faction had said, "I told you so," loud enough that now Windows 7 could run XP programs. Remember that? That all happened. It's ancient history now. It's 10 years ago. But it's an illustration of what goes on in corporations. So what you have here is that the people who are making these decisions at Microsoft, and when you look at it, the amount of money they've dumped into it for Microsoft really isn't that big a deal yet. These people are going to get their way as long as they can show that there's going to be a profit, that there's some way. Because the only thing that a corporation cares about, Google, Microsoft, Red Hat, any of them, no matter what their mission in life is or whatever, the only reason they exist is to make money. Keep it in the black, keep it in the black. So we got to wait and see what happens with Microsoft. We got to see, will they go along with this up to a point, and then there'll be some sort of a change at the top, and the powers that be will no longer be in power, and somebody else will take over, and they'll say, Steve Ballmer and Bill Gates had it right. We're going to go back to that. Who knows? So let's address the Windows issue, because we're talking about Microsoft, we're talking about cloud, we're talking about Linux. Where does Windows fit into this? Microsoft has demonstrated in the last couple of years that they really don't care much about Windows anymore. Windows is an old, entrenched technology at this point. And they have reduced the number of people that are actually working on that development, and you can see that there is, I think, a lot of the old guard that were trying to keep things more consistent in Windows. Maybe they don't have as loud a voice, or maybe they have been retired out. You know, it wasn't, what was it, a few years ago that they released, they got rid of so many employees? I have no idea. This is pure speculation on my part. But we're watching things like updates that destroy all the users' data. It seems that the marketing department has their hands into it. They want to collect all this information from the users. We hear about that, the security problems. We hear about the instability, the fact that it's slow. We hear about updates breaking things. We hear about the latest updates. They're not going to check for free space enough to be able to do it. This seems to me to be a development. It's kind of like they're phoning the development in at this point. They're resting on their laurels. It's a lot of old code that's in there. If it works, don't touch it. They've kind of just messed with it. It's not innovative at all, but it's entrenched. So, I mean, depending on what market numbers you look at, 90% of all the computers in the world are running Windows of some sort. That's because of Microsoft having that monopoly that they gained in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they've just held on to it, but they've not been the greatest steward of that. They've not treated their users very well over the years. And I think that is, I mean, it's going to have to change. It's going to, the reputation that they have is so sullied at this point and so stained, they've got to do something in the next few years. Right now, it's not hurting them, but it will hurt them later on. It's going to become more and more of an issue. There are people out there who, there are those 5 or 6 years ago that were going on and saying, well, I remember there was a very famous interview with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and they were talking about, well, people won't be using computers anymore. There won't be traditional laptops and desktops, and everybody's going to be moving to tablets and devices. That has not happened. That's a myth. The sales of laptops and computers have not really gone down all that much. There will always be people out there who want a keyboard and a mouse and a traditional way to deal with a computer. And Microsoft, even if they don't want to invest a great deal of money into that space right now, they're going to have to do something in the future. So my speculation is that Microsoft is gearing themselves up to buy a Linux distribution or create one of their own. I have said for a long time that there would be a point in time when Microsoft would come out with MS Linux, that would exist because just because of the code base in Windows. It might be a system that is aimed at professionals, developers, whatever, but this is a space that they're going to have to start competing in. They've proved it. Obviously, they believe that because of what they've done. There are rumblings, and I've been hearing these rumblings now for quite a while, that Microsoft may buy Canonical, the company that distributes Ubuntu. I don't have anything solid to back that up. It's just little things that I've picked up here listening to the chatter in the community, and every now and again you'll get something like that. They have worked very closely with Canonical over the last few years. Mark Shuttleworth, who is the head of Canonical, has made it perfectly clear that they want to have outside money, that they're interested in either having an IPO or an outright sale. Microsoft certainly has money. It might happen. I don't know. We'll see. But I would like to end this little diatribe up by saying that for those of you who get very concerned about this kind of news and you think, oh, well, Microsoft is going to buy Ubuntu and they're going to lock it down and it's not going to be open source and they're going to start tracking my personal information and it's going to be as bad as Windows and all that stuff. I don't know whether that's true or not. What I really think is going to happen is that you're going to see an integration. I think that you're going to come to a place where the next Windows 11, whenever that comes along, it's not going to be based on a Windows kernel. It may be based on a Microsoft Linux kernel. That kernel already exists. They have it for Azure Sphere. Maybe it's time for them to throw out that old code base and start new. So what we might have is that it'll be a Linux distribution. We'll call it Windows, and it may be seamless in such a way that people who are currently using Windows just all of a sudden get a faster, peppier, better system. So it would be like Linux with the most killer wine that you've ever seen in your life. In other words, Microsoft applications will run flawlessly on this Linux because they will develop the compatibility since they've opened up all the patents. That could very well be the future. So it might not be that we have an MS Linux. It could be that we have just a different Windows that has Linux at the base. Sort of like what happened when Apple went from the old architecture to when they adopted the BSD kernel when they went with OS X. That could very well happen over the next little while. They could have a separate Linux distribution. They could buy Ubuntu or some other Linux distribution. The main thing is they want in on this space. They want to be part of this party. And obviously so does IBM. And I think a lot of other companies out there too. This is not the end of this story. It is the beginning. If this makes you afraid, like I said, don't be. One of the great things about open source is that it's out on the internet. It's freely available to anyone who wants to learn how to use it. And I think there will always be an alternative. Even if Ubuntu gets absorbed into Microsoft and it becomes just a division of Microsoft, their Linux division at some point. If you don't want to use Ubuntu anymore, that's fine. There will be something else. There will always be a Manjaro or an Arch Linux or maybe even an OpenSUSE that people will go, okay, all right, well, we're going a little pain here because we got to move to a different distribution, but it could happen. And it's always going to be there. There's always going to be that open source movement. It's not going to go away, folks. They can't take it away from us. We may have to change, but they can't take it away. So I want to end up on that. And I want to thank you for listening to me run my mouth. Most of that is speculation, that last part of that video. I don't really know, but I think this is the beginning of big changes. As always, your feedback is always welcome. This is a video that concerns itself with a bit of politics, so I would ask that if you do comment, please keep your comments clean, short, and to the point. Thank you very much, because anything that is nasty, negative, or several paragraphs long will most likely be deleted. Okay? Please join the discussion at Easy Talk if you would too. Feel free to post something there. Join up. You can also check out Easy Linux on Facebook. And you can check out freedompenguin.com for more about Linux. You can check out easylinux.com to find out how this all comes together. You can find out more about the Easy Linux project. Don't know what the future is, gang. All I know is that it ain't boring, and it certainly has been very fun to watch. We're just going to sit back and keep on rolling and see what happens next. We'll do it again soon. Thank you.